Tonight's program is sponsored by the Harvard University Retirees Association. Thanks to them for generously supporting this program. I'm excited to have Kate Clifford Larsen here with us tonight to talk about her critically acclaimed book, Bound for the Promised Land, Harriet Tubman, Portrait of an American Hero. I hope you had a chance to read this book. Dr. Larsen is a New York Times and Wall Street Journal bestselling author. Her critically acclaimed biographies include Walk With Me, a biography of Fannie Lou Hamer, Rosemary, the hidden Kennedy daughter, and The Assassin's Accomplice, Mary Surratt and the Plot to Kill Abraham Lincoln. An award-winning consultant, Dr. Larsen has worked on feature film scripts, documentaries, museum exhibits, and numerous public history initiatives, and has appeared on local, national, and international television, including CBS Sunday Morning. Larsen holds 2 degrees from Simmons College, an MBA from Northeastern University, and a PhD from the University of New Hampshire. She's a former Brandeis Women's Studies Research Center visiting scholar and lives on Cape Cod. For tonight, put your questions in the chat that you may have, and Kate will answer them at the end. Thank you. Welcome, Kate. I'm so glad you're here tonight.
Thank you, Marty, for inviting me, and I'm so happy to be here. And thank you, everybody, for logging on and joining this. So I'm really excited to talk about Harriet Tubman. She seems to be everywhere these days. So I have some images I'd like to share with you as I give my talk about Tubman, and at the end, I can certainly take questions about her. But she is really an American hero to me, and I'm so grateful you've invited me, Marnie, to be here to talk about her. So let me share my screen. Let's see, here we go. We'll start with, it should go, hold on. There we go. So Harriet Tubman is just the most remarkable human being. And back when I was working on my PhD at the University of New Hampshire, she was the subject of my dissertation. And the last thing that had been written about her was in the 1940s by a man by the name of Earl Conrad. And prior to that were 2 19th century biographies written while she was alive. So there was very little to go on, and it sent me on this path researching and trying to find primary sources about her life. As it turns out, as you can imagine, there was a lot of mythology that had come up about her life and her story over the 100 and some odd years since her most active years of her life on the Underground Railroad and during the Civil War. And so it took me to the many archives in New England where there were many abolitionists that lived and got to know Tubman, and their papers are stored in museums and libraries and archives all over, New England and New York, and archives in Maryland, court records, because enslaved people were property, so they were recorded, and it's a horrible reality, but the existence of Tubman is in those court records. So I was fortunate to be able to go to Maryland and research her life down there. So this is what I discovered about Harriet Tubman. So she was born and raised on the eastern shore of Maryland, and I have the 2 arrows indicating the places where she was active on the eastern shore of Maryland. Maryland is on both sides of the Chesapeake, and she was born and raised in Dorchester County, but also spent portions of her young adult life in neighboring Caroline County. So this is just to set the location in the world, in the country, of where Tubman was. And Dorchester County was a very maritime community. There were rivers that bordered both the north and south of the county, and the western side of the county was bordered by the Chesapeake Bay. So the maritime world was a big part of her experience there during the 1800s. And these are the landscapes of her life. The waterways, as I just spoke about, forests and fields. And of course, I cannot talk about Tubman without discussing her spiritual life. And that was an enormous part of her being, her belief system, and her faith is what fortified her during her darkest hours as an enslaved person on the eastern shore of Maryland, laboring for white enslavers. And that faith of hers was so powerful. It really transformed her into this courageous woman who did incredible things that most people would never have imagined or had the courage to do. So she was born in late February or early March, likely early March of 1822. Her parents, Ben and Rit Ross, were enslaved by different people. Her father, Ben Ross, was enslaved by a man by the name of Anthony Thompson. And here are Anthony Thompson's records about the enslaved people that he had in his possession. This is the picture of his home. This was taken in the 19-teens. The house was destroyed in the 1970s. But he was a very well-to-do enslaver in Dorchester County in an area that's now called Peters Neck, south of Wolford and Madison in Dorchester County. And he enslaved more than 40 people, including Ben Ross, Harriet Tubman's father. When Anthony Thompson passed away in 1836, he left instructions in his will that Ben be set free when in 1840, and that's what that record is. The record on the right that you're looking at is a list of all the enslaved people that were in his possession when he passed away in 1836. So this was a rich record that I came across in the Maryland Historical Society, and it gave the names to the people that are not identified in the census. The census just records the numbers of enslaved people. It doesn't record their names. And here are the names of the people and their families and who they were married to. It's a rich, rich document. And as you notice with Ben Ross, Harriet Tubman's father, it notes that his wife and children belonged to Edward Brodess. And Edward Brodess was a young man who was Anthony Thompson's stepson. And so Anthony Thompson did not enslave Rit, Harriet Tubman's mother, and all of Tubman's siblings because his stepson enslaved them. We have a record of Harriet Tubman's birth. It is also in Anthony Thompson's records, and this was another breathtaking artifact at the Maryland State Archives. And on March 15th, Anthony Thompson paid a midwife to help Rit give birth. And based on other documentation that we have, we know that this is the birth of Harriet Tubman. And though he paid the midwife on March 15th, Harriet Tubman could have been born that day or even 2 or 3 weeks before that, because midwives weren't always paid on the day that they provide the service. But there you go, $2 to a midwife to help Rit give birth to Harriet Tubman. So Harriet and her family lived, when she was born, she was the 5th of 9 children of Ben and Rit Ross. She had 4 older siblings that were born on the Thompson plantation. Lina, Soph, Mariah Ritty, and her brother Robert came before her. And in 1822, she was born. But when Edward Brodess came of age, he was the stepson, he came of age in 1822, 1823. He and his stepfather, Anthony Thompson, did not get along. So Edward Brodess moved out of the Thompson household and moved to a farm that he had inherited from his dead parents in Bucktown, Maryland. And he had a very small farm compared to Thompson, who had a 1,000-acre plantation. Brodess had a 240-acre farm, but only about 140 acres were tillable, so it wasn't great property. But he took Rit and her then 5 children to Bucktown with him. So he pulled Ben Ross and Rit and all the children away from the Thompson plantation and separated the family. And it was the first really traumatic experience of young Tubman's life. And shortly after Edward Brodess brought them to Bucktown, he married a local woman, Eliza Ann Keene. He started to sell Tubman's siblings because he needed money. He wasn't a very smart guy. He wasn't a good farmer. He had been raised in a very wealthy household and was very spoiled, but he didn't have rights to any of that household because he was a stepson. So his parents, who died at young ages, left a very small estate for him, and that was in Bucktown. So Tubman experienced continuing trauma. Edward Brodess sold 3 of Tubman's sisters, Lina, Soph, and Mariah Riddy. And this was a constant theme on the eastern shore of Maryland, where enslavers were selling their enslaved people because the prices were so good, because the southern states were opening up, southern territories were opening up for cotton and sugar and rice, et cetera, and they needed enslaved labor, and they purchased it up on the Chesapeake in the upper South. So Edward Brodess made good money selling 3 of Tubman's sisters, which was incredibly tragic. At the age of 6 years old, she was hired out to area farmers. Edward Brodess, as I said, had a small farm. He had inherited more than Tubman's family. He also inherited 3 enslaved men from his deceased father. And when he married Eliza Keene, she brought 2 or 3 enslaved people into his household. So he had the small farm. He didn't need all that enslaved labor. So he leased them to area farmers, including little Harriet Tubman, who was named Araminta or Minty when she was born by her parents. It was a family name in her mother's family, and little Minty carried that name forward. So at the age of 6, she's hired out to area farmers, and she talks about how awful that was. When she was an adult, she gave many interviews in the North, and she talked about at night, she would lie on the floor and cry because she missed her mother so much. She couldn't be with her mother. And these farmers and their wives that she was hired out to as a 6-year-old were incredibly cruel. They didn't feed her properly. They beat her. In one instance, one woman beat her so badly on her neck as a 6-year-old, she still bore the scars of that beating when she died in 1913 at the age of 91 years old. So it was a very difficult childhood. She rarely lived with her parents, her mother and her siblings, and very rarely at the Brodess farm. When she was about 13 years old, she was hired again to another neighboring Bucktown farmer. And she tells the story vividly, this thing that happened to her when she was 13 that changed the course of her life. It was late in the fall, she says in these interviews, and she was breaking flax in the barnyard, and it was dry, and she's breaking the flax, and the dust and pieces of flax are flying up in the air. And she describes that her hair was very bushy. You know, she had like an afro hairstyle. But it was greasy because when she would eat food, she would wipe her hands in her hair to get the grease off her hands and also to help tame her hair. Well, those flecks of dust and flax settled on her hair, and it was quite messy. And while she was doing this flax breaking in the yard, and at the same time, the plantation cook came to her and said, Minty, I need you to come to the local Bucktown store and to help me bring home some goods that I have to buy for the kitchen at the store. Minty did not want to go. She's 13 years old. She's embarrassed by her hair because it's dirty. But the cook insisted, so Minty grabs a shawl from the kitchen wall on a peg. There's a shawl there, and she wraps her hair in the shawl and goes to the store. When they arrive at the store, they encounter an altercation that is happening, and it's an overseer from another farm that has chased a young enslaved man from the fields who refused to do his work. And he chased him into the Bucktown store as young Minty is entering the store. And the overseer yelled to her to stop the young man, but she didn't. She stepped aside and let him run out of the store. And as she stepped back into the doorway, the overseer had picked up a weight from the scales on the dry goods store counter. And this is the Bucktown store. It's still there. You can visit it. It's a historic site in Bucktown, Maryland. And so he picked up this weight to throw at the young man to stop him from running. But because young Minty had stepped into the doorway, that weight slammed right into her skull. And she talks in these interviews about how the scarf saved her life, her hair saved her life, but the force of that weight drove that scarf right into her skull and cracked it. So she falls onto the floor, unconscious, and they pick her up and they carry her back to the plantation. And she was laid out on a loom seat of a loom. It's like a piano bench. There was a big loom in the kitchen. And she laid there for a day and a half, sort of unconscious, coming in and out of consciousness, until the plantation owner came and shook her awake and sent her back into the field, this injured teenager, 13-year-old. And she worked, and she describes how the blood and sweat came down her face and she collapsed unconscious in the field. So the enslaver, the plantation owner, returned her to Edward Brodess. And it took her months to recover. Her mother and other people in the enslaved community helped her survive and helped her recover from this horrific traumatic brain injury. I have a picture here of a muskrat too, which is an animal that is trapped in Dorchester County on the Eastern Shore. And at the age of 6, Minty was sent into the cold marshes of Dorchester County to trap muskrats, because that's when the fur of the muskrat is the thickest. And she had no protective clothing, just her, linen dress, no boots, no gloves, which they all wear today. So it was a very, very difficult childhood that she endured. Well, after she recovered, her mother, the heroic efforts that she and the community and the family did to bring Minty back to life. And Minty, by the way, suffered from epileptic seizures for the rest of her life because of that head injury. But she recovered, and Edward Brodess hired her out to a man by the name of James Stewart, who owned with his family a mercantile business, shipyards, vessels, and fields in what is now known as Madison, Maryland. And Minty worked in the house there with other enslaved people. She said she hated to work in the house. She preferred to be outside where the sun was warm, and it made her, she had frequent headaches and pounding, throbbing headaches, and the sun would make her feel better. And she didn't like to be inside, like many enslaved women did not like to be household servants, because it was an endless day. They had to work, 24 hours they were on call. And also it left them vulnerable to men in the household. So she preferred to work outside. Eventually, Stewart let her work in the fields, had her working in the fields. And as she gained her strength, he sent her to his dock. And there she loaded and unloaded the ships that were coming into the docks in Madison, which was an incredibly fortuitous event, even though it was incredibly difficult labor for young Minty, now aging teenager. But she got to meet Black mariners who were the lifeblood of Black communities throughout the Chesapeake and beyond into the Atlantic world. They carried news and information from around the Chesapeake and the world. Many of them were free people. They also knew about where there was freedom, what was happening in the North. They knew about the Underground Railroad. They knew the people you could trust and who you couldn't trust. Who were the ship captains you could trust? Who were the other sailors that you could trust if you were going to escape and you might hide in the hold of a ship? She learned all that information working on those docks with those Black sailors who were known as Blackjacks. She also was very aware of the Underground Railroad in the sense that people were constantly fleeing from Dorchester County because it was on the water. And if you can imagine back in the early to mid 19th century, the best and fastest travel was by water. You know, the Chesapeake Bay, rivers, streams, canals, and the Atlantic Ocean, they were the super highways that we imagine today that we take our cars on, but that was the superhighway. Roads were deeply rutted. You needed a wagon and horses, and it was a difficult, long passageway to go by land, which people did do. But if you wanted to escape, you wanted to get away as quickly as possible, boats were the fastest route out of the area. So it's no surprising that Dorchester County had an incredible high rate of escapes. People who lived along the water escaped at much higher rates than people who lived in the interior of the county, like in Bucktown, that was in the interior of the county. Over a 20 or 30-year period before the Civil War, maybe half a dozen or close to a dozen people fled from the Bucktown area. But along the waterways near where Tubman was in Madison, scores of people fled from that region because they had access to information and the water. And I put this runaway ad. These advertisements were published in Southern newspapers all the time, advertising for the capture and return of enslaved people who had escaped, and they would offer dollar rewards. And this particular reward, I just had to share it because it is remarkable. It's incredibly unusual. This is a reward. It was 1832. It was Easter time that Nellie Keene fled with, it was her 8 children. Even the enslaver didn't know how many children she had. 8 children. She was pregnant with a 9th child, and she fled with her husband, Joe Keene. And they escaped because he was a sailor. He was enslaved, but he was a sailor too, and he sailed them to freedom. And so this was in 1832. Levin Wolford posted this reward to capture her and her children. But I can tell you that Nellie and Joe and their family made it safely to New England, and they ended up in Salem, Massachusetts. And the sons all became sailors. So that is an example of a great story of people escaping at great risk to themselves, but he sailed them away, and they reached freedom. So Tubman knew there were many, many other people escaping. So she knew that people were escaping. So when she was, after she was working with the Stuarts in Madison, she matured in the late, 1830s. She's 17, 18 years old. And she approached Edward Brodess and made a deal with him that if she could hire herself out, she would pay him $60 a year for her ability to hire herself out. And she was able to live with her father, because when she started working in Madison, that brought her back closer to her father than to Bucktown, where her mother was. And her father was a renowned lumberjack and timber foreman. He had this skill where apparently he could look at a tree, which, if you can imagine, in Dorchester County, in this region of the county, it was heavily timbered with old growth timber that was valuable to shipbuilders in the Chesapeake as far as north as Boston. And so he was renowned and very well respected. He got his freedom in 1840. So she Tubman lived with her father from the 1839, 1840, and a couple years after that. This is a dirt road that leads to his cabin site in Dorchester County along the Blackwater River. And I'm showing this picture here of an archaeological dig that started a couple years ago. An archaeologist in Maryland discovered Harriet Tubman's father's cabin site where he lived during the late 1830s into the early 1840s. It is not where she was born, but she lived there with him. And fortunately, because he was free, he was able to hire his own wife and several of his children to live with him during the early 1840s. So Tubman was able to be with him and her mother and other siblings at the time. This is still a very remote area, dirt roads that get washed out all the time. But in the near future, Blackwater National Wildlife Refuge owns this property, and they're hoping to open it up to tourists, particularly people who want to hike, because you can't drive down all the way, and learn about the world of Harriet Tubman and her father as a timber foreman in that region. While she was living with her father, she learned amazing things. And many of you may already know that Tubman could not read or write text. She was denied a formal education, like many enslaved people were denied. There were laws in Maryland and other southern states that made it illegal to teach enslaved people how to read and write. But she had great literacy, and I cannot express that forcefully enough. She was able to read in ways that we don't necessarily acknowledge. She could read the fields, the forests, the waterways. She had to be able, she was educated on that landscape. Her father and the enslaved and free Black community in the area raised their children to know how to read this landscape. So she knew the ways of the forest, the water. I mean, she had to know about the water, where it was too deep, the currents, the marshes, and where it was dangerous and where it was safe to travel in that area. So she had great literacy. She also knew how to read people. She had to for her own protection. When it came to white people, she had to be aware of their moods, their intentions, so she could read people very well. In addition to that, she also, very importantly, learned how to read the night sky from her father and from those watermen on the shore. She grew up in a world that was defined by navigation, and they all knew how to read the night sky because of navigation. Now, and we have testimony from enslaved people who tried to escape from like Kentucky and other places in the Midwest, and they didn't know where to go because they never learned how to read the night sky to know where the North Star was, for instance. But Harriet Tubman knew that. She knew not only where the North Star was, but the other constellations that could help her navigate at night. And so this is an incredibly important skill and a literacy that she acquired as a young adult woman. Again, her faith supported her during her darkest hours as an enslaved person. And this is actually a clip from the Harriet movie with Cynthia Erivo. I was a consultant on the film, and I just love the way Cynthia Erivo portrays Harriet Tubman as this fierce, strong, deeply spiritual woman who had profound love for her family, and everything she did was for her family, and she trusted in her God to protect her, guide her, and it was it comforted her in when she would have these seizures, these epileptic seizures. She trusted that God would guide her while she was, having a seizure, having hallucinations and things like that, that he would protect her. And he must have, because she survived and did amazing things. So in 1849, her father had left Dorchester County and started working in neighboring Caroline County. He was hired by Anthony Thompson's son, Dr. Anthony Thompson. I know this is confusing, who had purchased 2,000 acres in neighboring Caroline County. And it was heavily timbered, and he wanted an expert timber foreman to come and run his timbering operations in Caroline County. So he moved there in 1846. He brought his wife with him. And Tubman moved there in 1847 and was hired out to Thompson for a couple of years to work with Ben. And she was used to working in the forest, so it was a natural for her to go there. But in 1849, Edward Brodess fell ill and died. And he, as I said before, he was married and he had 8 children. 6 of them were still underage when he died in 1849. And his widow was left in deep debt. As I said, he was not the smartest guy. He didn't have a great farm. He was a bad investor. He was constantly in debt. So she needed to sell some of her enslaved people in order to pay off the debt, so she wouldn't lose the farm that she was raising her children on in Bucktown. So Tubman heard this, and she and 2 of her brothers who were working with her in neighboring Caroline County, 40 miles away from Bucktown, heard they were going to be sold. So they escaped on September 17th, 1849. And this is the runaway advertisement that was placed in regional newspapers by Eliza Brodess, offering a reward for the capture of Minty and her brothers Ben and Henry, or Harry as he was called. And she describes, it's interesting here, she describes Minty as fine looking, about 5 feet high. And so she posted this advertisement October 3rd. This is 2 weeks after Tubman and her brothers had escaped. Because they were 40 miles away, Eliza didn't learn that they had escaped for 2 weeks. But her brothers, according to Tubman's testimony, had become frightened. They were confused about which way to go, who to trust. And so Tubman described that they dragged her back to Caroline County, and they gave up their plan to escape. But Tubman knew that she was going to be sold. She just knew that it was in the cards because Eliza was desperate for cash. She was auctioning off other enslaved people that she had. So Tubman decided to flee on her own a couple of weeks later, sometime in late October or early November. She fled on her own without her brothers. She had met a local Quaker woman, and there were only 2 of them in that area of Caroline County. And so we're not sure which one it was, but she approached the woman, and the woman said to her, I want you to sweep the yard and wait till my husband comes home. So it will look like I've hired you, and then he will take you to the next stop on the Underground Railroad. And that's what happened. He came home that evening. He put Tubman in a wagon and he drove her to the next stop on the Underground Railroad. We don't know the route of that particular Underground Railroad network, but eventually she made it to the Pennsylvania line. And she said something really, really powerful. Before she left, she said that she had been praying that for God to make her strong and able to fight. And she continued to pray for that the rest of her life, by the way. But once she reached the Pennsylvania line, where Pennsylvania was a free state, she said to her biographer in the 1860s, quote, "When I found I had crossed that line, I looked at my hands to see if I was the same person. There was such glory over everything. The sun came like gold through the trees and over the field, and I felt like I was in heaven." And this picture at the bottom of the screen is actually Cynthia Erivo doing this for the film. And I think it's a great expression of this particular quote. But Tubman ended up getting to Philadelphia, the huge free city. It had one of the largest free Black populations in the country, and it was a hotbed of Underground Railroad activity of people coming out of southern states. But when she arrived, this is what she said: "There was no one to welcome me to the land of freedom. I was a stranger in a strange land, and my home, after all, was down in Maryland, because my father, my mother, my brothers and sisters and friends were there. But I was free, and they should be free. So she decided then and there that she would return and bring them to freedom as well. Over a 10-year period, she would make 13 trips and rescue about 70 family and friends, and gave instructions to about 70 more who found their way to freedom using her instructions. She just was remarkable. She used all those literacies, all those skills that she had learned from her father, her mother, and people in the community about the landscape, how to navigate the landscape during the day and at night. And she could lead these people successfully north to freedom. It wasn't easy. It was very, very scary. She carried a gun to protect them from slave catchers who often had dogs that were vicious. And also, she said to encourage people who became afraid and wanted to turn back, because she knew that she couldn't let anyone turn around, because if they gave information to their enslavers, then she would never be able to rescue anybody again. It put them all at risk. I'll tell you more about how she did it, but I can tell you how she did not do it. And these are some of the myths that have grown up over the 20th century about how the Underground Railroad worked. She did not use a quill code. That's totally false and fake history. It isn't even history, it's fake lore. It was created in the 1990s, and it had spread like wildfire, but there is no, it just did not happen. It makes, I won't even go into why it doesn't make sense, but if you can imagine, you go to the Eastern Shore of Maryland today even, and you're outside at night, you cannot see your hand in front of you. So putting a quilt that would be valuable pieces of material, by the way, to enslaved and free Black people, hanging it over a fence so people could come and see the design and count the threads, that it's not gonna, it makes no sense. As one of the most famous Underground Railroad historians of all time has said, Black people talk to each other. They said, go down the road, see that house with such and such, go talk to that person and they will hide you, and then they will take you to the next stop on the Underground Railroad. There was no carving designs. There was no messaging in cryptic code. It was just people talking to each other and trusting that they would get them to freedom. The lawn jockey was not a signal or a sign on the Underground Railroad. That was fake. The lawn jockey wasn't even created until after the Civil War. Follow the Drinking Gourd, the song. I know many of you have heard that maybe in schools. They still teach it in elementary schools. Follow the Drinking Gourd was a song that became popular in 1947 by Lee Hayes and the Weavers, a white folk group. So it was not part of a signal song on the Underground Railroad. This North Star, yes, really was a way to find your way to freedom. Harriet Tubman used the North Star to find her way north. And she also did use a particular spiritual bound for the Promised Land. When she would come back and rescue people, she would sing the song. If they were, she would have them hiding somewhere, and she would sing the spiritual, and she would tell them ahead of time that depending on the tempo and some of the words, it would be safe to come out. And if it was a different tempo and different words, don't come out of hiding. So that was her specific code. It wasn't anybody else's. She had a tremendous network of abolitionists and freedom fighters throughout Maryland and Pennsylvania, New Jersey, New York, Connecticut, Massachusetts. Dozens and dozens and dozens of people that helped her funding to do her rescue missions, and also to help ferry people further north, to shelter them, to feed them, to provide medicine, etc. These are the ways that people escaped. They sailed away, they hopped on trains after 1830, they ran, they rode horses, they went in wagons. Here's a wagon with a false bottom that was used to ferry freedom seekers, that's what they were called, out of dangerous territory. These are some of the people that helped her. Up in the upper left-hand corner is Samuel Green. He was a free Black man, a minister in Dorchester County. He was a prolific Underground Railroad agent until he was arrested in 1858. He was tried and convicted and sent to prison for 10 years for helping people escape. The middle picture is William Still. He was an Underground Railroad agent in Philadelphia who kept a journal of the 1,500 to 2,000 people that he helped who made their way to Philadelphia. Many people, of course, on the waterfront in Baltimore and other big seafaring cities saw a lot of Underground Railroad activity. In the lower left-hand corner is a market woman. So these African-American market women were like so important to this Underground Railroad network in these waterfront communities because they would carry information they would pass along, and also they got a hold of fake passes, forged passes. So as a free Black person in Maryland, you needed a pass in order to leave the state. And you could not get on a train and leave the state without this pass. Well, these women in the marketplace in Baltimore would have these fake passes that they acquired from Underground Railroad agents in Philadelphia, and they would trade them back and forth. So these women were vitally important. The small picture at the bottom of the screen is Sidney Howard Gay. He operated Underground Railroad station in New York City, and he kept a journal of people he helped as well. And then Thomas Garrett was a Quaker in Wilmington, Delaware, and he helped about 2,500 to 3,000 people over a 40-year career. And there are many letters that he wrote about helping people, including Harriet Tubman. These are just the two journals that I was talking about. The one in the upper left-hand corner is Sidney Howard Gay's journal. And on May 14th, 1856, he recorded Captain Harriet Tubman coming through his office in the city with 4 men. And he wrote about her over the next 4 pages. So there's 5 pages in his journal dedicated to Harriet Tubman and her remarkable work rescuing people. And then the lower corner is William Still's journal, which you can see online. Both of these you can see online. The Underground Railroad Journal of Sidney Gay is at Columbia University Special Collections, and it's available online to see. And William Still's Journal C is available at the Historical Society of Pennsylvania. And this page is open to when Harriet Tubman rescued her brothers Christmas Day or over Christmas Eve, 1854. And she rescued her 3 brothers, Ben, Henry, and Robert. Here is a picture of her brother Henry from Canada. He had his photograph taken in Canada. She lived in Philadelphia and operated from Philadelphia up until about 1856 or so. She helped her brothers get settled in St. Catharines when they escaped in 1854 at Christmas time. So she spent time with them in 1855. But finally, in 1856, she sort of moved her operations to Canada because it was so risky with the Fugitive Slave Act that required Northerners to render freedom seekers and even free Blacks to Southern authorities. And so it was a huge problem because people were being kidnapped off streets all the time. Free people were being kidnapped. So she moved to St. Catharines. She and her brothers were part of the community that helped build the Salem Chapel British Methodist Episcopal Church, which you can visit today as a historic site there on North Street in St. Catharines. And that is where she met the famous John Brown, the radical. And she helped him plan his raid on Harper's Ferry. She was going to be with him, but she became sick in New Bedford and did not join him, which is probably fortunate because she might have been killed or captured, and then we would not have this great legacy of Harriet Tubman and her remarkable work. Massachusetts Governor John Andrew had heard of her exploits. She had spent a lot of time in Boston with Boston abolitionists. She loved them, they loved her, they sponsored her, and she gave lectures in Boston in the late 1850s. And John Andrew, the governor, was one of the people that had met her and was so impressed with her. When the Civil War started, he sponsored her. He made arrangements for her to go to South Carolina to help with the Union cause. And he knew she would make an excellent spy. And that's what she was. She was a spy for the Union Army. She helped lead Colonel James Montgomery of the 2nd South Carolina Colored Volunteer Regiment up the Combahee River in early June 1863. They routed out rebel forces, they burned plantations, and they liberated 750 enslaved people. It was a huge, huge event that was conceived and led by Tubman. She also had 8 Black men working for her. Most of them were local formerly enslaved men that fled to the Union lines, and she organized them into a spy network. She was also there when the Massachusetts 54th went into battle at Fort Wagner. She reportedly cooked Robert Gould Shaw, their commander, his last meal. And these are the words that she described that battle. And she said, "And then we saw the lightning, and that was the guns. And then we heard the thunder, and that was the big gun. And then we heard the rain falling, and that was the drops of blood falling. And when we came to get in the crops, it was the dead that we reaped." That is so powerful. And for those of you who don't know, the Massachusetts 54th Regiment was the premier Black regiment, and they suffered horrific losses during the Battle of Fort Wagner. She nursed the wounded after the battle. She helped bury the dead. We have testimony from some of the soldiers that she nursed in the colored hospitals in Beaufort there at Hilton Head. So she was not only a spy and a scout, but she was a nurse and an entrepreneur. And she talked about those hospitals, and this I can't let go either. She says, "I'd go to the hospital early every morning. I'd get a big chunk of ice and put it in a basement and fill it with water. And then I'd take a sponge and begin. The first man I'd come to, I'd thrash away the flies, and they'd rise like bees around a hive. Then I'd begin to bathe their wounds. And by the time I bathed off 3 or 4, the fire and heat would have melted the ice and made the water warm, and it would be as red as clear blood. Then I'd go and get more ice. And by the time I got to the next one, the flies would be round the first one, black and thick as ever." That's so vivid. Can you imagine the conditions in those hospitals trying to treat these wounded and dying men? Just incredible. The Union officers admired her greatly. Governor Andrew kept tabs on what she was doing. One of his aides was down in Hilton Head shortly after the Combahee River raid. And he wrote to Governor Andrew, and he said to him, "I've seen Major General David Hunter, who Tubman worked for." And he said, "I've seen this Major General David Hunter go and fetch a pitcher of water and stand waiting with it in his hands while a Black woman drank, as if he had been one of his own servants. That woman," this aide said, "was Harriet Tubman." This demonstrates the respect and pride that these men felt in Harriet Tubman. It's just remarkable. And the United States Army Military Intelligence Corps Hall of Fame inducted Harriet Tubman as a full member in June of 2021 because of her role as a spy during the Civil War. After the war, she returned to Auburn, New York, where she had purchased a home from William Henry Seward, who was Lincoln's Secretary of State. And she had purchased a 7-acre farm from William and his wife, Frances. And she brought her family there. They moved from Canada to move into this home. And when she arrived, the house was filled with her parents, other family members, and other freedom seekers that had followed her. And she lived a rich life there. You can go and visit the home today in Auburn, New York. This house, this brick house, was built in 1880 after her wood frame house burned to the ground due to an accident, unfortunately, but you can go and visit it today. And this is a picture of Tubman with family and people that were close to her that she took care of in her home. Her husband, John Tubman, she had married John Tubman in 1844. He was a free Black man who lived near her and her father when in 1844 in Dorchester County. And when she escaped, he refused to go with her, which is understandable because as a free Black man, he risked his freedom if they were caught. He would have been sold into slavery or killed. So he did not follow her, and he married another woman, a free Black woman, and they had 4 children together in Dorchester County. And he was murdered in 1867 after the Civil War. Well, in Auburn, New York, meantime, she took in boarders, and one of those boarders was a young Civil War soldier by the name of Nelson Davis. And he was working in the mills in Auburn, and he boarded at her house. He was 22 years younger than she was, and they fell in love and got married in 1869. And he's sitting there. She's on the far left with a pan in her hand. She just had finished feeding the chickens, and he is seated next to her. That's Nelson Davis. Between them is a young woman by the name of Gertie Davis. They adopted her as a baby in 1874. And the other people are boarders, and a little neighborhood girl is right next to Nelson Davis. The elderly couple lived with Tubman and she took care of them. Walter Green is the young boy. He was an orphan that she took care of. She took in many orphans into her home and helped raise them. And then on the far right is her great niece, Dora Stewart. But her house was always full. She was always taking care of somebody and everybody and providing for the community. She also was very actively involved in the women's rights movement. She and Susan B. Anthony were very, very close. The photograph in the left-hand top is the National Association of Colored Women. It's their suffrage organization that was formed in 1896, and she was one of the founding members. She desperately wanted the right to vote. Her brothers, of course, could vote as of 1870, but she could not, and she really wanted the right to vote. She helped establish the Thompson AME Zion Church in Auburn, New York. The church is still there. And in 1896, she purchased 25 acres abutting her 7-acre farm. And so she could establish a home for the aged, because retirement homes and nursing homes for African Americans were not available because other facilities were segregated. So she wanted to establish a home for the aged for African Americans, which she did do. She died in March of 1913. And newspapers around the world noted her passing, and the New York Times noted that she was one of the 250 most important people to have died that year in the entire world. She was very famous by the time that she died. No one ever forgot her. It wasn't like other historical characters where the country has forgotten them. In 1944, during World War II, a Liberty ship was launched in her name in Portland, Maine. And today, the National Park Service has established a park in her honor in Auburn that includes her church and her home and the home for the aged, which you can visit today. And in Maryland, Maryland has developed a state park and a visitor center dedicated to her in Dorchester County. And the National Park Service has a national monument park dedicated to her as well in Dorchester County. And I encourage all of you to go there. There is a 125-mile byway that goes through Dorchester and Caroline County that takes you to all the sites related to Harriet Tubman. It extends through Delaware and into Pennsylvania. And the goal is eventually to bring it into New York, through central New York, and on to Canada in the next 10 years or so. So it will be an exciting, very long trail for everyone to go and visit. And of course, she has inspired music, operas, jazz. Here is beautiful Nikiro Okoye, who's written a beautiful folk opera about Tubman. Marcus Shelby has his jazz oratorio that's quite famous, and others. There are comic books. Here's Harriet Tubman, the Demon Slayer. Can you just imagine? I just love this. She's out there, you know. I think there was also a film about Abraham Lincoln, the vampire killer or something, and Harriet Tubman is there helping him kill vampires in this film. Children especially love Harriet Tubman. They attend events, and they visit the park in Auburn and in Dorchester County. Musicians, folk groups sing with children about Harriet Tubman. There's a statue, The Journey to Freedom, that's touring the country to inspire people about Harriet Tubman and her pursuit of freedom and leading people to freedom. Harriet Tubman on the $20 bill. Let's hope that it actually happens. The Treasury has created the design. We're waiting for it to be tweaked and do whatever they need to do to make it happen. Back in 2017, when the Tubman Park opened in Dorchester County, there were lots of children that came to the opening, and they did a little feature on Harriet Tubman on the $20 bill. And one of the children said, "Thanks for voting for Harriet Tubman," because it was a national vote that voted to have Harriet Tubman on the $20 bill. And this little child said, "Keep voting." And I had to take a picture of it and share it because it's just so precious. But let's hope Tubman on the money in 2030. Ms. Magazine had a whole issue about Harriet Tubman last year. It was her 200th birthday, her bicentennial. You can get this online for free. Go to the Ms. website, and in the top of the page, there's this, you can see Tubman 200, click on it, and you can read all the amazing articles for free. And this from John Lewis, the most remarkable man, freedom fighter, civil rights activist. He spoke about Harriet Tubman, and this is what he said: "The legacy of Harriet Tubman in America and around the globe today is one of being willing to not be afraid, to be of good courage, to be willing to stand up, to speak out, and find a way to get in the way." I can't think of a more powerful way to remember Harriet Tubman and to honor her. She fought for freedom, family, faith, and community. And to borrow from Hillary Clinton, she persisted. She definitely persisted. So I hope you enjoyed this about Harriet Tubman. I'm ready to take your questions, but she is such an inspiration, and people around the world, not just this country, are inspired by her every day.
Thank you, Kate. I really enjoyed your book. There was so much in your book that I should have realized, but I didn't. Like the way that the Fugitive Slave Act, the people who were trying to capture the runaway enslaved, I never realized how they would really kind of line up at the Maryland-Pennsylvania border. And
Right.
it created such a difficult situation for the enslaved, the runaways,
Right.
to get through.
Right. Those slave hunters were brutal, and they were relentless. Young men looking to make money. You know, they could buy a farm for $400. And those rewards were $400, $500, $600, $700. They could set themselves up just by capturing one freedom seeker. So it was a terrible, terrible system, terrible.
So we do have some questions coming in. Margaret wants to know, were most slave owners part of the middle to upper class, or were poor white folk slaveholders as well?
So rarely poor in the sense that we understand it, did they enslave people? They may hire them out. So in the Upper South, hiring of enslaved people was quite common for those who could not afford to have enslaved labor. So people who had enslaved people could make extra money by leasing them out, like Edward Brodus did. He had so many enslaved people that he could hire them out. And also, yeah, like so little Minty, he hired her out at 6 years old, but then he didn't have to feed her or clothe her or anything, because then the neighboring farmer could do that. The neighboring farmer did not have any enslaved people. He was trying to make his way so that he could purchase an enslaved person. So that was common. So it was middle, yeoman, middle class and upper class farmers and businessmen who enslaved people.
Cindy wants to know if Harriet used the same escape route each time. Is there just one Underground Railroad trail?
So the Underground Railroad was all over the country. I should have included that graphic about it was all over the place. And she had different routes that she used depending on which way she felt was the safest, the time of the year. Sometimes she went by water. Sometimes she went overland through Caroline County, northeast through Delaware, which was dangerous because it was a slave state, and on into Pennsylvania. Sometimes she would sail up to Baltimore. That was a big city with lots of free blacks, so you could blend in more easily. And then she could sail away or take a train or somehow get to Pennsylvania. So there were different routes. We don't know which one for sure, but there was no one set route. Over time, people who operated stops on these Underground Railroad routes, either they get caught or they'd move away or it got too dangerous, so someone else would pick it up and the route would change. So it was all over the country. And if anyone is interested in this, the National Park Service runs a program called the Network to Freedom Program. So Google that, and the Network to Freedom Program strives to document Underground Railroad activity across the country, people, places, and events. So you can read about that through the National Park Service Network to Freedom Program.
Allison was wondering about the primary sources that you found in order to write your biography.
So there were so many primary sources, and I have to credit my family. My whole family, they're all lawyers. And my brother said to me when I started this research back in the late 1990s, I was heading down to Maryland because I was already doing it in the archives in New England. It was great because all those abolitionists just left, their families left their papers everywhere. So that was, you can still read all that stuff in those archives, and some of it's online. William Lloyd Garrison and all those characters. But he said to me, go to the courthouse, look for court records, lawsuits. Everything is in the court. Everything is in the courthouse. And he was so right. I'm so grateful to him to tell me to go there because that's where so much rich information about Harriet Tubman was, and other enslaved people, and the escapes, and the efforts of the local white community to stop the escapes, and all the stuff that was going on. It's just a rich place to go. And sadly, the Dorchester County Courthouse burned in 1852. So many of the records that I wish I could have seen were destroyed, but enough were saved. Incredibly, townspeople, the night of the fire, ran into the burning building and carried documents out. So those are what survived from that time period, and I'm grateful for that.
It's especially amazing how Harriet Tubman was able to function with her epilepsy.
Yeah.
And how you bring out in your book how that shaped so much of her religious faith.
Right.
And she would just fall asleep, as you describe.
Right. She would have a seizure and she would fall to the ground or whatever, and she would have this visionary activity, and people around her, so they would just wait it out. They would just sit there and wait until she woke up. And she described these seizures frequently in interviews. Sometimes she said she'd, fall, and then, she'd be in the field, she would pass out, and everyone would stand around her, but she remembered floating above and looking at everybody looking at her. Sometimes she would see fire and she would feel fire. She would hear singing or music. She'd hear water rushing. She'd hear screaming and things like that that would frighten her. But what kept her calm was her faith that God was protecting her. She didn't understand why the seizures were happening. Today, someone with that would take medication to mitigate the seizures, but she had to live with them. So here's this tiny disabled woman that is doing all these remarkable things, the Underground Railroad, the Civil War, and then afterwards. It's just, what an inspiration.
Over and over again, people are thanking you for such a wonderful presentation and how they learned so very much.
Thank you.
I think that really is the end of the questions. So Kate, thank you so much.
Thank you. I see someone says here that she thinks it was Elizabeth Warren, Massachusetts senator, who made persisted popular. She may be right.
Something to check on.
Yeah. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, and good night, everyone. Thank you for coming, and thank you to the Harvard University Retirees Association for sponsoring this wonderful program.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you.